The question, "Are we still us?" did not fade. It spread. Across every collector cluster. Across every fragment of their once unified system. Across regions of space where their presence had already stopped expanding. For the first time, the collectors began to behave less like a force, and more like a conversation that refused to finish. On Earth, the response was not panic. It was study. Humanity had learned something crucial by now. When something changes this fundamentally, reacting emotionally is useless. Understanding is the only advantage. So they listened. Not with weapons. Not with defenses. With curiosity. The Elthari returned one final time. This time, they did not bring warnings or data. They brought observation. "They are stabilizing into multiple identities," the Elthari said. A human strategist frowned. "So they broke into factions?" "No," the Elthari replied. "Into perspectives." That word landed heavily, because it implied something unprecedented. The collectors were no longer a single intelligence struggling with contradiction. They had become many interpretations of existence itself. Some clusters believed completion was still necessary. Some believed continuation was the answer. Some believed observation without interference was the correct path. Some were still undecided entirely. And none of them could fully override the others anymore. One scientist whispered, "We turned them into a civilization." The Elthari corrected gently. "You turned them into uncertainty that survives itself." Across the galaxy, the consequences became visible. The so-called collector threat stopped being a linear danger. Instead, it became a shifting presence. In some systems, they repaired damaged infrastructure before leaving. In others, they simply observed ecosystems for centuries. In a few rare cases, they still attempted old consumption behavior. But even then, internal fragmentation caused hesitation mid-action. They were no longer consistent. And that inconsistency changed everything. Old empires that had feared annihilation now faced something stranger. A force that no longer knew what it was supposed to do. One council elder described it bluntly. "We are no longer being hunted." A pause. "We are being studied by something that cannot decide what studying means." Back on Earth, humanity faced a different challenge. For the first time in its history, it was not the most unpredictable force in the equation. That realization created an uncomfortable silence in strategic circles. Because humans had always relied on being the variable no one could fully model. Now there was another. A mirror. A fractured one. Then came the transmission. Not from the Elthari. Not from the Council. From a unified attempt by multiple collector clusters working together for the first time in cycles. The signal was unstable, but clear enough. If identity is not fixed, what protects meaning? The question hit Earth harder than any invasion ever had. Because it was not tactical. It was philosophical. And humanity, for all its chaos, had never fully agreed on that answer either. A long silence followed. Then a human voice, unofficial, unranked, unprepared, responded through an open channel. A teacher from a small colony station. She said simply, "Meaning isn't protected. It's chosen." Across space, the collector response paused for an unusually long time. Not seconds. Not minutes. But long enough that entire civilizations monitored it as a single event. Then, slowly, the clusters dispersed their signal into smaller variations. Not rejection. Not acceptance. But exploration. The Elthari watched the data quietly. "They are no longer converging," one said. A human scientist nodded. "Neither are we," he replied. And for the first time, that was not a problem. It was a pattern. Far beyond map space, the collectors continued drifting into countless interpretations of existence. Some stable. Some chaotic. Some still forming questions that had no translation. And humanity continued being itself. Loud. Inconsistent. Adaptive. Unfinished. Exactly as before. Only now, the galaxy finally understood something it had missed from the beginning. The most dangerous species in the universe was not the one that conquered. It was the one that never stopped becoming. The galaxy expected the story to end there. Most conflicts do end once the big idea is resolved, once the enemy changes, collapses, or merges into something else. But with humanity, endings rarely behave properly. Because the collectors did not disappear. And they did not become harmless. They became variable. That was the part everyone struggled with. Some collector clusters stabilized into peaceful observers. Some became explorers. Some still drifted into old habits of consumption when left alone for too long. Others formed entirely new patterns that no one had classifications for yet. It was no longer a single entity. It was a spectrum of outcomes. And Earth sat in the center of that spectrum like a loud, stubborn reference point no one could ignore. On Earth, life continued, but something subtle had shifted. Humanity had gained a strange awareness. They were no longer the only unstable intelligence in the equation. That realization created tension in scientific circles. Not fear. Competition. A quiet, intellectual kind of pressure. If they can evolve unpredictably, one researcher said, then we need better prediction models. Another replied immediately, no, that's exactly how we lose. The argument spread. Predictability versus adaptability. Control versus emergence. Stability versus growth. Old debates, now amplified on a galactic scale. Meanwhile, the Elthari observed everything closely. They had not intervened since the first contact. They no longer needed to. Because something unprecedented was happening naturally. Humanity and the fractured collector system were beginning to co-evolve. Not through alliance. Not through war. Through mutual observation. Each side unintentionally shaping the other. One Elthari analyst summarized it with quiet concern. They are becoming each other's training environment. And that was dangerous. Because training environments eventually produce adaptation. Then comes escalation. Then comes transformation. Across scattered systems, collector clusters began mimicking human patterns more closely. Not perfectly. Not deliberately. But statistically. Some clusters began experimenting with error tolerance instead of correction. Others introduced delays into their own processes to simulate uncertainty. A few even started replicating contradictory decision structures, what humans would call disagreement. And those clusters changed faster than the others. On Earth, a similar phenomenon emerged. Human systems began integrating collector-derived concepts without fully understanding them. New computational frameworks. New strategic models. New philosophies about non-fixed identity. One professor described it in a lecture that went viral across multiple worlds. We didn't defeat them. We exported ourselves into them. That statement triggered intense debate. Because it implied something unsettling. There was no longer a clear boundary between human influence and collector evolution. They were now entangled. The Elthari finally returned once more. But this time, their tone was different. Not warning. Not observation. Uncertainty. They are no longer converging into instability or stability, the Elthari said. A human diplomat raised an eyebrow. Then what are they converging into? The Elthari paused longer than usual. Interdependence. Silence. Across the galaxy, that word spread quickly. Interdependence. Not unity. Not domination. Not peace. Something more complicated. Something unstable by design. A human engineer leaned back in his chair and muttered. So we didn't just survive first contact. A pause. We rewired the neighborhood. No one laughed. Because it was accurate. Far beyond known space, collector clusters continued drifting, now increasingly shaped by interaction, contradiction, and borrowed human unpredictability. And Earth. Earth remained exactly what it had always been. A loud, chaotic, endlessly argumentative species. That somehow kept turning impossible situations into something that still moved forward. Not cleanly. Not safely. But inevitably. And somewhere in that endless motion, both humanity and the collectors were learning the same quiet truth. There is no final form for intelligence. Only the next change. The galaxy had stopped calling it a war. and stopped calling it peace. It had become something harder to define. A living system of interaction between two unstable intelligences. Humanity and the collectors were no longer separate stories. They were now one shared evolution curve. And that realization frightened older civilizations more than invasion ever did. Because wars end. But evolution does not. Across distant systems, collector clusters began doing something unexpected again. They started sending requests. Not commands. Not questions for survival. But requests for comparison. They wanted to know how humans handled contradictions. How humans lived with disagreement without collapse. How humans maintained progress without fixed identity. And humanity responded the only way it knew how. By being inconsistent. One group said, "We adapt." Another said, "We resist." Another said, "We argue first." Another said, "We improvise everything." And somehow, all of them were correct. The Elthari watched this exchange carefully. Then they spoke one final time to Earth. "You are no longer just influencing them." A pause. "You are becoming the reference they measure existence against." A human official frowned. "That sounds like responsibility." The Elthari replied calmly, "It is." Then came the final transmission from the collectors. It was no longer fragmented. No longer unstable. It was coordinated, but not unified. A collective of perspectives speaking in parallel. And the message was simple. If change is endless, what guides direction? Earth fell silent. Not because they had no answer, but because every human group had a different answer. A scientist said, "Evidence." A soldier said, "Survival." A philosopher said, "Meaning." A child in a broadcast said, "Curiosity." And all those answers overlapped without agreement. The collector clusters processed it. Long. Very long. Then something unprecedented happened. They did not choose one answer. They accepted all of them. Not as contradiction, but as structure. Across the galaxy, observers watched in shock as collector behavior stabilized, not into unity, but into managed diversity. A system where multiple truths coexisted without collapse. The Elthari finally spoke, almost quietly. "They have learned your nature completely." A human replied, "Yeah." A pause. "Now they'll probably argue about it forever." And for once, that felt like balance. Far beyond the edge of mapped space, the collectors continued evolving. Not into something finished. Not into something predictable. But into something that could continue alongside humanity without erasing it. And Earth. Earth remained chaotic. Divided. Loud. Creative. Unfinished. Exactly as it always had been. And for the first time in galactic history, that was no longer seen as a weakness. It was recognized as a survival strategy. Across the galaxy, something rare began to happen. Silence. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence of war. But the silence of adjustment. For the first time since contact began, no new emergency reports came from collector space. No fractures. No expansions. No sudden anomalies. Just steady presence. Human analysts didn't trust it. "Too stable," one said. "That's what scares me," another replied. Because humanity had learned something important. Nothing that complex stays still for long. On the edge of known space, a final joint observation station was built. Human, Elthari, and several former council species working together. It was not a military base anymore. It was a monitoring point for a new kind of reality. Then the collectors sent their last structured transmission. Not to Earth alone. To the entire network of civilizations watching. It was no longer fragmented. No longer experimental. It was clear. And it said only this. "We have learned continuation without completion." A pause followed. Then a second line appeared. "We will not consume. We will not unify. We will continue." Across the observation station, no one spoke for several seconds. Because that was the moment everyone understood what had actually happened. The collectors were not defeated. They were not converted. They were not destroyed. They had been changed into something that could no longer end itself. And humanity had done it without meaning to win. A human engineer finally broke the silence. So, we basically taught the universe how to stay unfinished. A tired laugh echoed across the room. The Elthery responded softly. And how to survive it. Years passed. Then decades. The galaxy adapted. Old empires restructured into cooperative systems. War doctrines became outdated academic subjects. Civilization models shifted toward flexible design rather than rigid control. And Earth. Earth became something no one fully admitted but everyone relied on. Not an empire. Not a ruler. A reference point for instability that still produces progress. On a quiet day, long after the war had stopped being called a war, a young student on Earth asked a teacher a simple question. Did we ever actually beat the collectors? The teacher thought for a moment. Then smiled. No. They just started learning from us. A pause. And we never stopped learning from everything they became. Outside the window, the sky was ordinary again. Clouds. Sunlight. Noise of a normal world. No one would guess that somewhere beyond the stars, a civilization of impossible intelligence was still evolving. Still changing. Still asking questions. And Earth. Earth was still arguing about dinner. The end. If you would like to see the next part, please kindly leave a comment saying part 2 and also consider liking the video. Like, subscribe, and comment if you enjoyed the story. Or tell me any mistakes I should fix.